Margot emerged first. "Come on, Les!" "I'm coming. You know this is stupid, right?" He looked back behind him, hoping there wasn't a form of a frantic middle-aged woman running down the grocery aisle, calling out their names. Margot, having never been discouraged by Lester's pessimism before, wasn't leaning into any sort of discouragement now. All at once, the two escapees had their running footsteps rhythmically synced. "This way!" Margot shouted, looking back over her shoulder, but not out of fear, solely as one who was making sure her tandem bicyclist was pedaling as fast as she was. This part of Seattle reeked of a combination of fish markets and coffee shops. It was also annoyingly crowded, even in the cold. The usual gray landscape premiered tall buildings that dissipated at the water's edge. They were like icy blocks, surrendering their territory to the vast blue wash, speckled with toy ships and docks. Les and Margot called this their home. Margot stopped at the perimeter of this inner city. "You think she'll find us?" panted Les, stopping in a heap just beside his older sister, with an added but obvious thought, mentioning that they were in no uncertain terms dead if she did. "Nah." Margot was staring at the watery landscape. Les looked up from his recovery position, hands still placed firmly on his knees, to look at whatever had captured his sister's attention. "Oh, Margot," he retorted, not without exasperation. "He is not coming back." At this, Margot flinched. "I've been looking through Dad's stuff." Les let out a vicious sigh and a full circle of an eye roll to the extent that Margot had to repeat herself. "I've been looking through Dad's stuff, and I saw some sort of legal agreement with a certain Conrad Shipping Company." Her dark eyebrows over her beautiful blue eyes were raised in an effort to capture hope, the hope that seemed so fleeting. Les kept silent, having learned full well where his place was in this dialogue. Margot was smart, a capable leader, and usually right, but what he saw before him was a hemorrhaging heart, bleeding since the day their father disappeared. If all his personal impulses were to play out, both of them would be turning upon their heels and heading home, like right then. But compassion stopped him, just to the point that he didn't answer with an immediate argument. "He's out there, Les." She looked down to pick up a pebble, throwing it loosely into the water. "I know it." She drifted off with the stone she had just cast. "Out there?" thought Les. That was a worse idea than gone forever. "Doing what?" was all that came to the surface of the dark waters. "Look!" Margot woke exuberantly out of her stupor and pointed. She read slowly the words, "Conrad Shipping Co." Lester tried instantly to change the subject. "By all accounts, Mark, we are delinquents. If we run away again, Aunt Marie is going to turn us into the state." Of course, he knew sweet Aunt Marie, who did not deserve any of these shenanigans, was as kind-hearted as her brother, their father, and most likely knew exactly where they were because they were always here, just where their father was last seen. Possessing the utmost poise and controlled tone, Margot looked her brother square in the face, as if never having done it before, and stiffly replied, "Some questions need answers, Lester." Les wondered when this was going to be let go of. He had cast the whole thing off like a live hand grenade found buried under his feet. After all, it had been 3 years. There were plenty of questions that didn't need answering, as far as Les was concerned. In fact, the unanswered questions served quite well as a shield to undesirable pain, like why did Mom have to die when she was so young? Could they really process the answer if there was one? What if the answer wasn't good enough? Or why did they have to live in such a cold place like Seattle, constantly reminding them of their loss? No good reasons for that ever came to the surface. Or why was Dad gone in a time when Les needed his example most? To be sure, Les thought of his heartbreak as irreparable, unanswerable, and therefore forgettable. This was simply, albeit perhaps momentarily, a semi-sustainable option to coping with the tragedy. Margot seemed to want to revel in it and find no viable solutions in doing so on purpose. He loved his sister but could not comprehend her drive. "Let's just go look for a second," she urged. Les begrudgingly followed his scampering sister in an arch shape down the dock toward a small whitish-gray building. It was an odd-looking building, and as many times as he had been there before, he wasn't sure he had ever seen it. It had a wooden boardwalk jutting out in front of it, harboring a steep climb from the main dock to its landing. What was most curious about it was its storefront sign, for as the young teenagers reached the pinnacle of their quest up the side of the building to its entrance, the sign changed to read Skipper's Crab Shack. Margot was dumbfounded as well as Lester. "That is not what the sign read at all," she exclaimed defiantly. Les stood with a duplicated expression as he pondered the possible explanations. The first possibility was that they were both out of their minds. That option was a bit concerning, and it further emboldened the inclination that they should just leave, like as in an instant return home, and he turned to do so. "No!" Now close to tears, Margot dug into her resolve. "Lester, you saw it too." "I don't know what I saw, Marg." He commenced to finish his climb down the rickety steps. "Enough of this. Let's go." She stood gazing down at him, arms folded for a solid moment, concocting her own plan. "Ahoy!" A sound came from somewhere around Les's feet. Emerging into visibility, a short, rotund man smiled up at both of them. While Lester wanted to inform this stranger that no one said "ahoy" anymore, Margot interrupted and embarked on a genuine dialogue with him. Les protestingly glared at her. "Do you know about the Conrad Shipping Company?" Impatience was Margot's virtue at this point. The short mouse of a man with a striped shirt and dirty trousers smiled impishly and looked as though he would try to evade the question for a moment. But Margot, not forgetting her manners, introduced herself. "My name is Margot," and also not permitting the last name to be disclosed. "What is your name?" "Copper." Why, thought Lester, did this man look like he was lying? Lester interrupted the exchange. "Well, have a nice day. We got to get back home, and unfortunately, I have to take her with me." "That's a shame." The strange creature was still smiling with his eyes. Les and Margot raised their gaze in unison for once. There was no doubt this man's presence raised enough curiosity and amusement to rid an afternoon TV watching of its purpose. He slowly continued, "I do know of a certain company, but it's not my company." There now seemed to be unraveling in his little mind a brand new idea that excited him. "Would you like to meet him?" "Who?" Cue the chorus from the teenage choir, Margot singing soprano, Les tenor. "The owner of the Conrad Shipping Company, of course." The tiny man beamed brighter than a lighthouse. Les let out an adamant "No." Margot didn't have to express her protest with words. "Les, this is our chance." His quick response leveled the prospects. This company, or whatever it is, never letting down his pessimism for a second, can't even keep their sign in the same place. The whole thing smells of something shady. His eyes continue to try to speak some sense into the situation. "All we have to do is ask." As if suddenly reminded, Margot queried, "Yeah, what about that sign?" The striped imp grinned widely, his eyes asking for clarification about a mystery he was unaware of. "The sign that read Conrad Shipping Co." she exclaimed, not without slight loss of composure. "It now reads Skipper's Crab Shack." She pointed to the sign clearly described. "Oh, that!" With a hearty chuckle, as hearty as a little man could make, he continued to presumably add some information that he thought should have been already known by all present. "It only comes out when we need it." Les and Margot looked at each other slack-jawed, but the stranger had moved on to nobler things. "Let's go meet the captain, then." Copper had a dancing little skip of a step, and with a wave of his hand over his head, he motioned them to come. "You know, Les," in a sideways gait in the boy's direction, as both teens, Les more hesitantly, walked with him. Margot moves forward because she asked questions. Les nodded slightly, half listening, but then it occurred to him that he had never introduced himself and stopped mid-stride. Marg?" At once, both the teenagers looked up to see a remarkable sailing vessel in front of them, contentedly perched along the dock, dwarfing all the second-thought fishing vessels around it. Her sails were drawn, and her gangway stretched out in such a way as to make the ship look as though she was reclining in the fairest weather Seattle had seen in months. Scores of odd-looking seamen of all shapes, origins, and sizes were scurrying here, tightening ropes there, loading freight with a heave and a hoe, and then immediately jogging, or waddling as it were, back down the timber to load another. Sketched along the side of the ship was its name, Deborah. Margot and Les paused at the bow, port side of the ship, gazing up at the lettering, neither one mentioning its significance out loud. Copper pushed in between them like the family pet. "Lovely name, isn't it? Cap'n won't sail any other." Panic replaced the inquisitive look that had marked Margot's face. "Les, I want to go." "Something wrong?" squeaked the little companion, perhaps slightly unwanted at this particular point. "Nah," Les answered, attempting equilibrium while glancing cautiously at his sister. "Just a familiar name, that's all." "Don't you want to meet the captain?" said in such a way as to betray not an ounce of awareness that an earthquake had erupted under Margot's feet. But then the small man looked squarely in Margot's eyes, just the way she was accustomed to, and added, "'Twill only take half a moment," smiling almost to himself, but with the tenderest of eyes. "Don't you have any more questions?" "Sun's out," Copper announced. "Captain should be on deck." Whether or not they were aware of it, they were following this little man to uncover more questions than Margot and Les could ever dream of, but not without a few answers. "The name's Bairn," said with all the jolliness of a combat-hardened warrior. The captain of the Deborah stood what felt like leagues above them, as if they were the sand beneath his callous-booted feet. He displayed all authority that could possibly be captured and held on to from this ship, and maybe others. Maybe he could commandeer the authority over the vast ocean life. This remained to be discovered. He left no room for further wonderment. His eyes were dark, his gaze direct, and both teens suddenly felt like they might already be wasting his time. They had not yet required even a moment of it, but perhaps, to their anxious minds, they were conspiring against the air for his breath? Surely. They supposed simultaneously they were next to walk the plank, to coin the phrase, without any clue as to what they did to arouse the sentence, or where the plank was, for that matter. Les half looked around for any sign of their future fate on the faces of the ragged seamen and on the sides of the sailing vessel. Margot proceeded, the captain's heavy eyebrows furrowed as he let out some kind of full-throttle grunt. At this juncture, the untimely imp found his sea legs and ventured a reconciliation of sorts. "Cap'n!" he cried, as if he were keen on selling a new line of sardines to an Italian pizza shop owned by a Swedish miser. "I found these kids on the dock." Then leaving off with a whisper, "They are asking about the Conrad, sir." The grunt was reprised, yet this time with a steeper climb between the heavy furrowed eyebrows. "What about it?" he growled. The imp giggled ashamedly in somewhat of a retreat. "My dad, sir." Margot summoned up all her bravery to finish the sentence. "He's missing. I thought—" Then sadly and suddenly came the collapse of effort. "He had some papers," entered the brother, who was seldom unaccounted for or slack when protecting his sister. "They were about Conrad Shipping Company," as evenly delivered as a scared 14-year-old could muster. The eyebrows that had once spelled a certain doom and destruction raised like an unfolded umbrella over the instantly surprised eyes. "Now there's a story, aye, Copper?" Whether that was a question or an agitated declaration was anyone's guess. He suddenly looked out behind him over this open sea. "You two are coming with me." An abrupt and direct order, leaving no room anywhere in the delivery for debate. "What? No!" Lester grabbed his sister's arm and attempted an escape, immediately thwarted by the ragged-tailed seaman that previously looked semi-harmless, but apparently stood by for these kinds of grim orders. The captain let out a mighty roar of laughter that seemed long kept. Even Copper jolted with surprise. "Please," Margot screamed as she wrestled fruitlessly against her adversaries. "I just want to know about my father." Copper shuffled around both the teenagers while they were being tied up, shushing and at the same time comforting, simultaneously encouraging Margot and Les, but admonishing them not to fight, also not holding back a wallop or two from the heads of the seamen that appeared to be too rough with them. "It's right, kids. Captain knows what he's up to," Copper meekly offered. "How could you?" Les might not have been sure who he was referring to at that moment, but he further addressed Copper harshly. "You'll pay." The captain, not even rendered aware of her pleas or Les's threats, grabbed the railing of the bow with unbridled glee, his eyes more and more fixed on the horizon. He possessed the look of someone awakened after a long, hard winter of sleep. "Heave anchor, ye lads. There'll be celebration tonight. his large voice wafting down the railing under the floorboards and alighting the steps of his charge. "And don't you be slow about it!" A dark laugh arose from the strange man's deeper insides as he stood hunched over the rail, eyes fixed. Under the radar of all around him, he spoke. "Aye, man in the shadows, your time is up." All told, and all efforts exerted to thwart the onslaught by two young kids, the Deborah began to set sail, unabated, while the crew's celebrations commenced. Margot sat overwhelmed with betrayal and disappointment, Lester adversely consumed with anger. He kept his eyes glued on what he thought of as the chief betrayer, Copper, who sheepishly offered at intervals water or a bite of something to eat from the goings-on below deck. He had taken great pains to sneak the victuals out to them, but Lester declined it in as hard a manner as he could, though defeatedly tied to a pole. "I'm so sorry, Les," Margot whimpered. "I should have listened to you." Though Les was tempted to respond with the proverbial "I told you so," he just sighed heavily. "It will be all right, Marg. I'll figure this out." Having started one of his intervals of service, Copper, as if he was part of the conspiracy to escape, interjected, "It never takes one to do the thing." "Shut up!" Lester could not contain himself any longer. "Lester!" Margot, forgetting herself as well. "Do we really need more enemies?" Copper lowered his head and gave a semblance of understanding. "Lester, might I—" "No. I just wanted to say—" "You've done enough!" Lester would not break for the least of any of the circumstances that surrounded him. To do so meant to let in a flood that was bent on overwhelming him. If he could keep an enemy to prove he was in control, he would do so, starting with Copper. "Lester, listen to him." Margot now pleaded from a sense of total loss. Copper offered something, well aware it would most likely hit the ground where it was presented. The thing we don't want might ultimately be the thing we did. He looked at Margot with a slight twinkle in his eyes and waddled off toward the sounds of great jubilation under the twilight. "I don't like you. I think you lie, and you aren't even making any sense." Those were Lester's final thoughts on the matter, mostly to himself, though he tried to yell them loud enough to the disappearing little man with large ears. Later, Lester found himself hungry despite himself, and Margot found herself overcome with shame. She imagined her poor aunt scouring the seaside, summoning the police, and causing general panic with friends, along with the few family members that lived in Seattle. Aunt Marie would be so heartbroken. The irony dawned upon Marg clearly, for it was pain that drove her to the water in the first place, for her father lost at sea, and once again, it seemed, the sea would win. The Deborah glided along as if barely touching the water, sails full tilt, a dream for anyone who actually wanted to be sailing in the undisclosed direction it was going. The sun had been so bright, quite a change from the usual Seattle gray, and despite the despairing situation, Margot and Les weren't as uncomfortable as might be expected. Clenched together by ropes, with the posts supporting their backsides unwaveringly, the night air had also enclosed them, without a prick of cold, and the sky slowly filled with specks of twinkling light that sheltered their young heads. Copper made one last round, which brought somewhat of a relief to the teens. Though Lester would not have admitted as much, his stomach had got the better of him, and he complied with the offering. As Copper turned to go, he paused for a moment. "You might want to keep an open mind tonight." He grinned slightly and scuttled off. It was well after dark by this time, and though neither of the kids could have put their finger on it, things were moving around them differently on the ship itself. Les thought that Copper looked shorter, and Margot noticed that he no longer had shoes on. His eyes had grown weirdly bigger, even his ears seemed larger. Just general thoughts that had not, as yet, marked their significance in their minds permanently. "Hey!" Lester collected himself and pictured their position, tied up forever, with a startled realization. "Untie us! No use leaving us here." "Soon, lad, soon." Already from far down the gangway came the reply. Sometime past midnight, Lester and Margot fell asleep under the vast pinholes of shining lights. As far away as the vessel was taking them, their dreams swept them away further. Margot dreamed about her father. He was a large Australian man with wavy burnt blonde hair and sapphire blue eyes. She got her eye color from him. In the dream, they were on one of their many camping trips outside of Vancouver. She saw him sitting with his face glowing against the flickering campfire, telling them one of his favorite stories that she had heard an abundance of times before. His arms were draped over his guitar, grinning his distinguishable smile, eyes squinted, and dimples surfacing like large rocks against the foamy white sea of teeth. She sat there enraptured, heart open, then suddenly a pull. Her resistance followed, but then another pull. Something was jolting her out of her sleep. Then she felt something like wet slobber around her tied-up hands. Margot half opened her eyes to a sound somewhat close to a growl, and all doubts that this came from a dubious source were extinguished when she saw the large, black, fur-laden mammal gnawing on the ropes that held both her and her brother. Her screams broke the night in half, resulting in her brother jolted awake. Between cries of "Get off!" and "Lester!" Les realized the large black bear was not aimed at consuming two teenagers, but biting off the ropes. Perhaps a little confused still, he endeavored to calm Margot down. "It's biting off the ropes," a remark that sounded like a whisper compared to the previous shrieks. Margot came to her senses when she realized she felt no amount of pain, just wet from animal saliva. With a somewhat shaky yet noticeably less alarmed tone, she asked, "Where did it come from, Les?" "I have no idea," was the reply that was quickly followed by a new revelation. "Forget about it, Mark. Let's get out of here." Shaking loose from the ropes, Les grabbed his sister's arm to pull her up. "How?" Margot's turn for pessimism. "We are miles from Seattle, Les, and who knows what direction we sailed." Les grabbed his sister's shoulders. "You want to stay here?" The giant bear had already disappeared into the archway of the captain's quarters with a strange aloofness, but at this very moment, with Margot's face turned against the mast, and Lester possessing a full view of it, he saw the greenest, largest, and longest snake he had ever seen, even at the Seattle Zoo, slithering its way down from the crow's nest. A relenting response from Margot came, still fully engaged in a conversation she thought was taking place. No, but what was curious to her, at this juncture, was Les's seemingly unprovoked distraction. She looked hard for a reason for the preoccupation on his face, while he increased his grip on her shoulders. "What are you looking at?" she questioned. He snapped his focus back to his sister. "Nothing?" He thought he might as well try to lie for her sake. His facial contortions merged from worry to sheepishness in exemplary fashion. She gave him a knowing look and slowly turned to look behind her. Much like the reaction of soda and vinegar came the reaction between snake and girl. After she could muster the capability to communicate again with decipherable words, she expedited the issue at hand to full execution. "We are leaving now, Les." Secured to the side of the bulwark, Les had remembered there was a dinghy, and that was what the two were aimed at. Sliding across the slippery beam, she yelled, as though this were all her idea to begin with, "Help me untie this!" The night seemed illumined somehow, but it wasn't just the stars. The air was warm, yes, but it was like they were sailing in broad daylight around the Caribbean. The two paid little attention to these phenomena as they struggled with the movement of the Deborah over the glassy waves, their legs unsure of the watery terrain and the ways of a seagoer. Their hands were momentarily unable to maneuver their wet ropes. Right as efforts were making minimal progress, a strange sound like tiny feet made its way into their senses. Sure as the clear night sky hanging over them, a fat mouse ran up to them and presumed to get in the way of their pursuits. It ran up and stood on the ropes that were consuming all the efforts of the two teenagers, switching from Margot's side to Lester's. Les swatted at it a couple of times, which only seemed to deepen its resolve. "What the—" Lester sounded off. "Get out of here!" blazing fully ahead toward escape, no matter the interference. "Les, wait!" Attempting an acquittal for the furry animal, Margot continued, "Maybe it's trying to tell us something." She almost grimaced at her own conjecture. Les had had enough of the crazy, though. "No, Margot, it's not." Succinct and unmoved, but then he did notice something about the rodent's eyes that had continued to stare at him in a kind of plea. They were both familiar in shade, and could it be warmth? The teenagers paused the mission they so desired to complete. Fear was their driving force, the fleeting promise of return their aim. They could not imagine how both these motivators were suddenly futile, and yet there they stood, distracted by a fat mouse with warmth in its eyes. The mouse stood suddenly erect on its hind feet, seemingly noticing the pause, and with an oddly familiar wave over its tiny head, indeed signaled them to follow. They followed the round but awfully quick mouse below the poop deck, and then down below the quarterdeck on a rickety spiral staircase. These quarters were wet with seawater and slippery as the rest of the ship. They landed somewhere near the stern, the farthest they could go. Les expected a horrible stench, familiar on oil sailing vessels, but there wasn't any. It was dark, yet the pathway of the mouse seemed to be illumined, like the rest of the ship and the surrounding waters. Up on the wall of the starboard side of the ship was an inscription. The mouse climbed around it frantically, standing below it, leaning against the wall and looking up at it, turning around quickly to look at them again, and repeating its small frantic gestures. Margot read it aloud. When numbers are added to, and trails cross again, listen to your kin. Hark the rumbling of smoke from the drifting mountains. He's sure to lose his hold. When all again seems lost, the pathway dark and drear, fear ye not, ye seamen, 'twill no longer be set adrift, but release of the captives.